You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Life is like living in a rented mansion, where the owner could come back at any time and take the house back. It'd be naive to think that you can stay there forever, but it would be foolish not to enjoy all of the benefits of that mansion while you're in it. In life, we own nothing, but rent everything. And we are back in Ecclesiastes now, picking up where we left off halfway through chapter 5. Been a little while since we have been here, so thank you for joining us again on this study, and I hope you enjoyed some of the special episodes that we had in the meantime. We will be doing more topic-based episodes and interviews in the future. In fact, we already have several more planned for the rest of this year. But in the meantime, we have to finish up Ecclesiastes. So we'll pick up now in verse 8 of Ecclesiastes 5. And just recall that at this point, the verse numbering is a little off-kilter in the English versus the Hebrew. We discussed this back a couple episodes ago in our Ecclesiastes series. So technically, this is actually chapter 5, verse 7 in Hebrew, but just because the way the chapters were divided up once it came over into English, we have it as verse 8. Doesn't really make a big difference. It's still the same information one way or another. It's just one number off. Let me read verses 8 and 9 together here for a second. They are not going to seem super complicated, but there's actually a ridiculous amount of variation in potential interpretations just of these two verses. And it's going to be based on some kind of obscure, minor, nerdy grammatical oddities. So if you are a nerd like me who loves that sort of thing, you are about to have a heyday in this episode just in these first two verses. If that's not your thing, don't worry, we won't be focusing on that too long, and I'm still going to try to make this as interesting as I can, because while I'm pitching it as something that sounds really dry, it's actually not. This is a great example of why we can't just say, oh, the Bible says it, and I believe it, and that settles it, or I just go with the plain meaning of the text. These two verses alone have somewhere around 8 to 10 different possible meanings, just depending on which way you read the verse. And that's not even to say that one is necessarily better than the others, or that we can figure out exactly what the one right meaning is. In fact, it's quite likely, since this is a very complex Hebrew wisdom literature, that this nuance and complexity and double entendre is actually purposeful. I tend to think that the writer of Ecclesiastes, or Qoheleth as the speaker, has purposefully worked some ambiguity into what he is saying so that it forces you to reread this. And each time you do, you walk away with a slightly different meaning. And now it's time for Rants with Colin, the part of the episode where Colin comes out and rants about something. A lot of evangelical preachers and pastors have this fascination with making the Bible stripped down, basic, child-friendly, and really simplified to this, oh, it's so easy to understand sort of thing. Even a child could get it. Here you go. And I get why they do that. You know, they want to present their message as something that anyone can learn from and have benefit in their life from. But you're really selling the Bible short if you do that. And then honestly, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot as well. Because if something is so simple that a child can understand it, you know, take a young adult book or TV show or movie or whatever, and it can be good. It can be something that you can enjoy even at an older age, but it's not necessarily going to be something that's often going to have a lot of really deep themes and inviting you to return back to it to study it more. It's probably going to be at a more basic level. So if you try to present the Bible as just this basic book that anyone can understand, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot, because then you're telling people it's not going to be long before you've learned everything there is to know about this. it's not going to be long before you have outgrown the Bible. And it's no wonder then that so many of these churches have people who are frustrated saying, I get nothing out of my Bible study. Well, that's because you were told it's this one simple, basic, easy to understand thing. And when you see that enough times, eventually it gets old and you go, well, I guess I've learned everything there is to learn from the Bible. Now, there are simple aspects of the Bible. There are parts of the Bible that can be read by children, but it is a very deeply complex, nuanced, beautiful work of art. And I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to set our own biases aside of wanting the Bible to be a simple book in order to say there's actually a lifetime's worth of study, honestly, in just about any one of these books, sometimes even in just a single chapter. How do you like that? We've only been back for 5 minutes on this series, and I've already gone on a little side trail rant. But I think that really is important to state so that we realize this isn't just getting into the weeds for getting into the weeds' sake. I am showing you all of these different nuances in the text because I want you to allow this truth to permeate into your view of the Bible and your view of other people who read the Bible too. Because when you have the idea that the Bible's simple, it's really easy to set up everybody who doesn't have the exact same simple, quote unquote, interpretation that you do as the enemy, as those liberals just trying to destroy the Bible or what have you. Instead, we need to realize that if the text has complexity and nuance, then maybe these other people who are coming at it with different interpretations than I am are actually legitimate in their interpretation. I'm not saying you have to throw away yours in favor of theirs or vice versa, but maybe you could invite them to the table and listen to their perspective on it and see if it can inform what you have to say on this as well. So again, this isn't just nerdiness for nerdiness sake. This is actually a very important principle of how we need to be willing to let the complexity of Scripture speak and not water it down like an abridged book for a third grade class, because that's not what the Bible is. Okay, agreed? I mean, I can't hear you, and if you just randomly said that in public, then that's a little weird, but I appreciate your enthusiasm. All right, let's get into the verses here. Verse 8, if you see the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, because he who is higher than the highest regards, and there are those who are higher than them. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. Okay, again, doesn't seem that complex. But it starts getting complex in the second half of verse 8. The verse literally reads, if you see oppression of the poor and stolen justice and equity in a district, don't be surprised. Surely higher than the highest watches, and higher than them. Now, even if grammar was not your favorite class in high school, which if it was, I'm so sorry that you struggled to have friends. But in all seriousness, I mean, I've always enjoyed grammar, and I've been a grammar nerd for a long time, so you've got a friend in me at least, all right? And as much as I'd like to, we can't play that sound clip here, or else we'll get copyright problems with Disney. So let me read that literal translation of it again and see if you can pick up why it just sounds weird. If you see oppression of the poor and stolen justice and equity in a district, don't be surprised. And here's where it really hits in the second half of the verse. Surely higher than the highest watches, and higher than them. So the second part of that, the very end of the verse, it's missing a verb in there. It's actually something called a verbless clause, which really creative name there, right? There's no verb in that clause. So it should be supplied, you would say, and there is higher than them, there is someone higher than them. You can see where now we have a little bit of room for ambiguity. And there are basically 3 or 4 main perspectives on what this could mean. So I'm going to take a look here basing this off of Uncut, the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. They kind of lay this out in pretty good detail. And they say that all approaches to this verse recognize that Qoheleth describes difficulties with the political system. Some argue that the verse declaims the inequities of an excessive bureaucracy in what might be called the red tape interpretation. Others believe that the problem arises as higher officials fleece those lower than they are until the poor, who have no one below them to oppress, are reached. And there's a third option, that the officials are protecting each other against the rights of the people they govern. So, this is me talking now. Basically, the red tape idea of this verse is saying that if there is some sort of perversion of justice, there's an injustice that happens, and you go to the courts, you go to the officials, the police, whatever, and you try to get it solved, there's just so much bureaucracy involved. There's all the red tape, there's all the forms you have to fill out, you just end up getting lost in the crowd, nothing ever happens. So with the statement, there are higher than them at the very end of the verse, it could just be saying that you kind of just have to keep going higher and higher up, and nothing ever really gets done about the problem. That's a possible interpretation. The second interpretation, where he said that the higher officials fleece those lower ones, is basically saying that you take just, I don't know what the lowest government office would be in a town, but take like the lowest person on the totem pole, and they are taking advantage of the people under their watch. Well, the person over them is taking advantage of them, and the person over them is taking advantage of them. It's kind of this trickle down effect where everyone's just maybe taxing a tiny bit more than they have to stuff their pockets. Or maybe the mayor had a really bad day with his campaign and he's not going to get reelected, so he takes it out on the person under him, and they take it out on the person under them, and they take it out on the person under that, and just so forth and so on down the line. That is also possible and also relatable when dealing with government. And then the third option is saying that perhaps there's actually just this hierarchy, this good old boys club, where everyone in line in the government is protecting the next one. They all are covering each other's backs so that nobody actually is held accountable for anything like that. So when it's saying that there be those that are higher than them, it's almost like the first interpretation, the red tape one, but this is a little more intentional. It's a little more nefarious. This is a very purposeful perverting of judgment. Now, there are also a few scholars who tried to take a positive interpretation for this verse. They put a more positive spin on it. And this can be based on some arguments from the Aramaic Targumim. The Targums were later Jewish writings. They're not quite commentary. They're like part commentary, part translation, part just their own thing. All right. But they give some creative interpretations a lot of times of biblical texts. So in some of those Targumim, they suggest that it's kind of like the red tape interpretation, but if you put a positive spin on it, if you assumed that having somebody over each of these people was actually a good thing. Uncut describes it as having checks and balances over the officials, with the one at the very top, either the king or God himself, as the ultimate assurance of justice. End quote. So in this case, you're saying that having someone higher than the person higher than you is actually a good thing, because they then are an authority over that person. So if the person over you is being unjust, you can go over their head to the person over them. Grammatically, that is certainly a possibility. However, it doesn't really fit with what Qoheleth is saying here, because he is saying that there is oppression going on and that we shouldn't be surprised when there is gross miscarriage of justice. So it wouldn't really make sense for him to follow that up with saying, but there's people who watch over those people, so they're going to get it in the end. Remember, he is purposefully trying to be a divergent voice from a lot of the other wisdom tradition. He's almost like a devil's advocate here in a lot of ways. He is playing against the accepted wisdom of his day, some of which was likely even recorded in other biblical books like Job and Proverbs and Psalms, and saying, that's really nice, black and white, on paper, sounds great. But what about when you get out into the complex gray world where sometimes this black and white, good versus evil, doesn't always pan out? So I don't think that the positive interpretation makes a ton of sense for this verse. Now, of the three more negative interpretations, honestly, I think it could go any way on those. I don't think that we necessarily have to pick one over the other. I think all three could fit and speak into what he's trying to say there. And part of the complexity comes down to just the little transition word in the middle of the verse, for. In some cases, it can mean because, but it can also mean surely or certainly or indeed. So whichever one of those you choose is going to kind of change the meaning. Is he saying don't be surprised at miscarriage of justice because there are higher than higher ones? Or is he saying, don't be surprised at the miscarriage of justice? Indeed, there are higher than higher ones. So the indeed idea could lean more into a positive reading, the because idea could lean more into a negative reading. And again, these are all legitimate grammatical possibilities. You can't really just cross one off and say, oh, that doesn't work. No, they all work. And I don't personally think the positive one works in the context, but you can't rule out any of the others from that. So again, we have to proceed with humility in this and realize that if you read that in a different light than I do, that's okay. And it's not something that makes a big deal. Sometimes we get so deep into the nitty gritty of, oh, this is what the Bible means. And it's like, well, there's actually complexity to it. There's nuance. There's depth of meaning. And it's okay if you take a little bit of a different road on it than I do. All right. How are we feeling? Just starting off right off the bat with something really complicated there. Well, verse 9 is honestly just as, if not more complicated to translate and interpret than verse 8. The verse literally reads, "And the remainder of the land to all, he, the king, the field serves." Again, you can see how this could be a little bit difficult to get the proper idea, or really any idea, into English. The remainder of the land to all, he, the king, the field serves. Now here I'm going to draw on the work of the Net Bible notes, because they lay out, they say 3 basic interpretive options, but they end up giving you like 5 options actually for this verse. So the first one is that the king takes care of the security of the cultivated land. In this instance, you would translate the verse, "In any case, the advantage of a country is that there is a king for the cultivated land." Now, I realize that some of this is all going to run together as I'm talking here, so all of this will be put up in the notes on the website for this episode. It'll probably be easier to look at, so I realize that, and just realize once these episodes go out, usually just give it a day or two. It's definitely within a week, and we get the show notes up there for each episode, so that might be easier to come back and check this part out again when you can actually read it. So the first option, the king takes care of the security of the cultivated land. And you would translate it, "In any case, the advantage of a country is that there is a king for the cultivated land." Possible. Second option, the king is in favor of a prosperous agricultural policy. And you would translate it, "In any case, the advantage of a country is that there is a king who is obeyed for the sake of agriculture." So can you see there's a little bit of a different idea between those two? In the first one, the king is taking responsibility of the land under him. He's giving order to it. So like it may not have been a cultivated field if he didn't tell people to cultivate the field. In the second option, he's actually interested in what's happening there. Like this is somebody who is trying to now benefit his government by having this land farmed. A little bit of a nuance. Third option takes it a different way and says the king exploits the poor farmers. In this case, you would translate it, "The produce of the land is seized by all, even the king is served by the field." Now, this version, I think, has the most going for it. And the Net Bible notes point out that the NIV and the RSV both take this translation option. The NIV reads, "The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields." And the RSV says, "The profit of the land is among all of them. A cultivated field has a king." But there's another option from the opposite angle, and this is something that the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Tanakh, went with. It reads, "The abundance of the earth is for everyone. The king is dependent on the tilled field." And this is actually the direction that a lot of English translations go as well. They try to take a neutral or positive portrayal of the king. So in other words, the fruit, the produce of this field benefits everyone, including even the king. And that's okay grammatically, but Uncut points out the problem with that in the context of these verses. It says, "First, it must be admitted that the preceding verse, with all of its textual problems, leaves little room for hope." So, in other words, this is me jumping in for a second, why would this verse now be positive if the other one had a negative portrayal of government? Getting back to the quote. "Second, in the other contexts in which political leaders, and especially kings, are mentioned, they are not viewed as the great saviors of the land. In chapter 8, verses 2 through 6, for instance, Qoheleth teaches how to avoid the wrath of the king, whose word, though wrong or oppressive, cannot be gainsaid. Qoheleth has already stated that there are two classes of individuals, the oppressed and the oppressors, and there is no one to rescue the former from the latter. The land is the land that is ruled by the king. In sum, the book's negative view of leadership elsewhere strongly suggests the same view prevails here. End of quote. I agree with Uncut there. I think that we should read this in a negative sense, where he is saying that more than likely the king is exploiting the poor farmers under his care, saying that he seizes the benefit of their labor on the land. Okay, nerdy grammar stuff mostly done for today, at least for the moment. We're going to move now into the rest of this chapter, which addresses in depth the concept of wealth. Let's start reading in verse 10. Whoever loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. And remember that word vanity, it's the Hebrew word hevel. It means breath, it means burr, smoke, a whole array of things. And you can go back to our first couple episodes in the series to talk more about that. I usually just try to transliterate it as hevel here to remind us that it doesn't mean vanity or meaninglessness, as a lot of English translations say. Verse 11, when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. I'm going to pause there. Now, Uncut observes a difference in views here between Qoheleth and the rest of the Bible's wisdom literature. It reads, in Proverbs, wealth is something that can be the result of wise behavior. It is a gift from God and worthy of pursuit. Now, while Proverbs also recognizes that one can get rich and be wicked, or be wise and poor, it's fair to say that Qoheleth does not share that book's optimism about riches. End of quote. So, in other words, if you were to read Proverbs, it's very much a black and white book. There's a reason it's so popular amongst a lot of Christians. It's easy read, the chapters are short, it's aphorisms, it sounds kind of like you're reading Ben Franklin's, Poor Richard's Almanac. But being early to bed and early to rise does not guarantee that you will be healthy, wealthy, or wise. And that's kind of what Qoheleth is suggesting here. Well, just because you are righteous, just because you are a good person, just because you follow God, doesn't actually mean you're going to be wealthy or wise or powerful or even happy. So what's the point? Proverbs tends to put wealth up as this basically a reward for serving Yahweh. In fact, argument can be made that a good portion of the Torah is based in retributive theology. Now, that's a fancy term that means God treats you based on how you treat him. In other words, if you obey him, he's going to bless you. Good things are going to happen in your life. If you disobey him, he's going to punish you. Bad things are going to happen in your life. Retributive theology. In more common parlance, we call it essentially the health and wealth gospel. In other words, if you do the right thing, you are going to be healthy and you are going to be wealthy. Sort of a name it and claim it, Joel Osteen style of Christianity. And it's so interesting to me how many Christians I know, at least growing up independent fundamental Baptist, who would completely tear apart a health and wealth prosperity gospel if they heard it from the lips of someone like Osteen. But there's a reason that there are prosperity preachers out there and people listen to them. And it's because they back it up with Bible verses, usually from the first 5 books of the Bible. Because honestly, a lot of God's covenant with Israel was very much a health and wealth gospel. It was very much retributive theology. Do this and X will happen. Don't do this and Y will happen. Now, this is a whole other conversation for another day, but interestingly enough, a lot of times, X didn't always happen when you did what you were supposed to do, and Y didn't always happen when you didn't do what you were supposed to do. And that's what Qoheleth is drawing attention to. He's pointing out this flaw in the system, as Bible Project puts it, that he has seen in the worldview of Proverbs, Psalms, and much of the Torah. This do right and God will bless you, do wrong and God will punish you, sounds great on paper, but doesn't actually work out in the real world. And think about it. If that were actually the case, and a lot of Christians have this theology, they have the belief that if something good in my life happens, it's because God's pleased with me. If something bad happens, it must be because God's ticked off at me. If that were true, we wouldn't have any prayer requests in church, because those are God's people. Those are the righteous people, the good people, and they have bad things happening in their lives. How many times have you talked to a Christian friend and they have just as much crappy stuff happening in your life as your non-Christian friends? And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes your non-Christian friends are succeeding more. Does that mean God is blessing them and punishing the Christians? What did the Christians do? No. You end up in this ridiculous loop thinking, oh, just because I stubbed my toe or got a flat tire today, God must be ticked off at me. And Qoheleth is saying maybe it's not that simple. Maybe good things in life aren't necessarily a sign of divine favor, and bad things a sign of divine disfavor. Maybe it's just this crapshoot of life where you get what you get. No matter what you put into it, the system is already rigged. Doesn't matter how many times you pull the lever, you're going to get the one same result every single time. Like, this is what is going to happen. Again, this is another conversation for another day, but I personally hate retributive theology. And I have to acknowledge it is strong in the Tanakh. There is a good bit of it, especially in the Torah and in some of the prophets, and we have to wrestle with that. But there is a serious danger in taking that sort of theology, because bad things happen to all of us. And a lot of times it's not anyone's fault. It's just living in a broken world. And think about Jesus when he healed that one blind man, and the disciples say, well, whose fault is it that he was born blind? Did God know that he was going to commit some horrible sin later on, so he struck him blind? Did his parents do something awful, and so God punished them by giving them a blind son? Whose fault is this? And Jesus said, it's nobody's fault. It's just the way that life happened, and now God can be glorified by his being healed. We have to be really careful of this retributive theology stance, because it can get us thinking that God hates us when something bad happened in life, when in reality it was just life being life. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's where Jesus said it rains on the just and the unjust. This is a great example of how there is a multivocality in Scripture. And yet again, another big fancy term here, many vocal voices. There are many voices in Scripture. And a lot of preachers like to give you the idea that the Bible is a univocal text. Open it anywhere and it's like every single page was written by the exact same person. And many of them would say it was. That's God. But we can't ignore the fact that he used many human authors. And they all came from different backgrounds with different perspectives, sometimes even different languages. So we have to acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives, sometimes even put side by side, so that we can get a fuller picture of what's going on in Scripture. We don't have to be afraid of the multivocality of Scripture. We can actually revel in it. And the people who are afraid of it, I just look at them sometimes and go, have you checked the first 4 books of your New Testament? Because they're all the exact same story, just told from different perspectives. Have you checked the first page of your Bible? Because Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are the same story told 2 very different ways, which, shameless plug here, go back and check out our episodes on Genesis 1 and 2 if you're wondering what I'm talking about. The Bible is full of these stories told in slightly different ways, different perspectives. Sometimes things change even in the Bible, and that's not necessarily a contradiction or something where we can go, aha, the Bible's not true, or something that we should be afraid of and trying to sweep under the rug and hide. It's actually something we can be celebrating, where we say, yeah, Proverbs has some great wisdom, but it's not, gasp, I'm about to say it, it's not perfect. It's not 100% accurate all the time. I know some of you are about ready to quit this podcast and say, Colin, what are you talking about? It's the Bible. Well, remember, the book of Proverbs is called what? Really easy. Proverbs. It's not called Promises. When the author of Proverbs writes, train up a child in the way he will go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it, he is not promising you that your child will turn out perfectly if you do all the right things. He's saying, this is a proverb, this is an aphorism, this is a general rule in life that if you put effort into raising your children well, that there's a better chance you're stacking the odds in your favor that they're going to turn out decently. But it's not a promise. It's not a perfect one-for-one correspondence. It doesn't always happen that way. Now, there's other issues with that verse as well that make it mean not what a lot of people think it means, but that's another issue for another day. But my point is that Proverbs isn't meant to be this book of promises that you grasp at and then wonder why life didn't happen that way. Then you just start to blame yourself and think, what did I do wrong? Because obviously God said if I do X, Y will happen, and that hasn't happened, so I must not have done X perfect enough. And can you feel the anxiety rising? Because that's not always how it works. And that's where the multivocality of Scripture comes in. If all we had was Proverbs, you might think that's a happier book than Ecclesiastes. But in my opinion, Ecclesiastes is actually a happier book because it's more honest. I'm not trying to diss Proverbs or say we should throw out Proverbs. There's beauty and wisdom and awesomeness in Proverbs. But it's not the full picture. We also need someone to come along and say, well, that sounds great on paper, but what about all those times that's not what happens? What about all those times when the righteous person has all their crops die and the wicked person down the road has the biggest bumper crop the town has ever seen? How do you describe that? How do you explain that, Proverbs? That's what Qoheleth is doing. He's saying there's a glitch in this system. What are we going to do about it? And that's honestly kind of the whole question of Ecclesiastes, is when Proverbs doesn't work anymore, how are you going to live? When you go down the rabbit hole of the Matrix, what are you going to do once you realize that there is a glitch in the Matrix, that sometimes life doesn't work out like a Proverbs world? We can live by Proverbs principles, but you're living in an Ecclesiastes world. You can stack the odds in your favor of a good resolution, but you're not guaranteed anything. And I think maybe I'm tipping my hand a little bit here too early, since we still have half the book to go. But this is, I think, the main idea of Ecclesiastes, is don't throw out Proverbs. Do what you can to stack the odds in your favor, but realize that it's not a guarantee. So live in the moment, because you're not actually guaranteed a long life just because you serve God or go to church every week or put money in the offering plate or fill in the blank with whatever good deed you do. Life is complicated, and so we need a nuanced, complex book like Ecclesiastes to say, sometimes life just sucks. So how can we make the most of it? So this is where he picks up on money, because I think this is the direction a lot of people would go. Well, maybe I can find some security in money. And I think everyone, if you were to ask them, would say, oh, money can't buy happiness. Life is about a lot more than money. But when you kind of boil it down, we all do, in so many ways, live for money. I mean, quit your job for a little while, or end up on unemployment for a little while, and see how long that lasts for you. We need money to survive. That's just our culture. And interestingly enough, and this goes back, I think, to our very first episode on the stuff you don't know about Ecclesiastes, this is when Ecclesiastes was being written. It was a time when money was just becoming popular in the Mediterranean world. That's not the way culture has always been. We didn't always have coins and currency to trade for things. There was more of a barter system a lot of times. So it's kind of intriguing to me how much this has already taken over the culture of Qoheleth's day, that he's speaking in such a way that it sounds just like today, even though it was a relatively new innovation at the time. So as he's talking about money here, and he says that whoever loves silver won't be satisfied with it, nor whoever loves abundance with increase. This is Hevel. When goods increase, they are increased to eat them. And what good is there to the owners of it except for just staring at it? Money changes you. We know better than to think that money can buy happiness, but we still stress over the lack of it as if that is what defines unhappiness. In reality, though, money has about as much of an effect on your happiness as the weather, perhaps even less. Which is to say that it's only as much as you let it, and maybe a bit more subconsciously. Different people are affected by the weather in different ways. You can have a dreary day and it might make you feel a little bit dreary. Some people, it could actually affect their mood some, but you realize that, tomorrow the sun's going to shine again, and maybe it just adds a little smile to your day if it's a really nice, bright, sunny, gorgeous day out. But it's not necessarily going to take you from depressed to ecstatic or from ecstatic to depressed just based on the weather. And Qoheleth is kind of saying, well, that's the way money is too. We give it so much weight in our lives, but in reality, having money isn't going to make you less depressed. Having money isn't going to make your life worth living. Not having money is not going to make your life not worth living. See, we get this idea that, if I can just get to a point of being comfortable, then I'll be okay. I'm not trying to get rich. I'm not trying to be a millionaire. I just want to be comfortable. Folks, it's 2024, and the simple reality is there is never enough money to be comfortable. Even if you were a millionaire, you still wouldn't be comfortable because you're trying to move up in circles. You're trying to show that you're worthy of this money. You're trying to fit in at the parties. And then you're just worried about losing all of the extra stuff that you have now. Instead of worrying about losing the $1,000 in your bank account, now you're worried about losing the $100,000 in your bank account, which is the same stress multiplied by 100. There is never enough in savings, never to worry again. That is a lie that so many of us believe, but there's just no way to be comfortable in the economy that we have. Brown in the Interpretation Bible Commentary says, consumption, in short, does not render contentment. Let me say that again. Consumption does not render contentment. It simply leads to more consumption, a vicious cycle. This is me speaking here, basically being a shopaholic, thinking that, if I can just buy that one addition to whatever, get that one collectible item, buy this new furniture, get that new car, whatever it is, then I will feel happy because I will have gotten this one thing that I wanted. When I was a kid, I always wanted to buy this and I never could, and so now I've got it. Well, consumption doesn't render contentment. There is no thing out there that you can buy that will make you content. Now, I think Qoheleth would jump in and say that maybe having it gives you a little bit of happiness. You might enjoy being able to see it, but at the end of the day, what can you actually do besides see it? Now, I've mentioned many times on here, I'm a big Star Wars nerd, and as I'm recording this right now, I have a bunch of Star Wars Black Series figures surrounding my desk, and I love collecting Star Wars action figures. I've been doing it since 2007. It has gotten really expensive in the last 5 to 10 years, so I don't do it nearly as much as I used to. But when I get that new figure, there is a high of, oh, awesome, I've got this, and I just completed the set. Actually, just in this past week, this is a perfect illustration right here. Just in this past week, I got in a figure that completed a set that I had been trying to complete for about 5 years. And for the few nerds of you out there that care, it was Sabine Wren. I got the Sabine Black Series to finish out the Spectre crew from Star Wars Rebels. I had gotten all of the rest of them over the course of the years. They were very hard to get, and Sabine shot up in price like 4 times what she was worth. And I was just able to find it used this past week at a reasonable rate and picked it up. That made me really happy. And I like being able to look over and see that set completed. But you know what? Another figure is going to come out that I'm going to want, and it's probably going to be part of another set that's going to make me just want to get that set. And eventually, I'm going to get used to seeing Sabine in that set, just like I got used to seeing the other figures of the set there. Or someone could steal it, or it could get lost, or damaged, or chewed up by a dog, or whatever. It's not going to bring contentment for me to have that, even though it bugged me for 5 years that I didn't have the set complete. Consumption does not render contentment. Replace my example with anything else that you have off in the distant future that you think is going to make you happy. And in all honesty, if I can kind of stretch the point a little bit, I think we can do this beyond just the matter of money and stuff you can buy. What do you think is going to make you happy? That promotion? That relationship, that marriage, that child, that whatever, it's not. Now, it might give you a little bit of happiness, it might brighten a few days, but you will not wake up the day after obtaining that promotion or relationship or marriage or kid or whatever and go, oh, wow, I want nothing in life. No, there's going to be a new something that you want. Consumption doesn't stop. It is a vicious cycle. So Qoheleth's whole point in dragging us along this tedious working of all of the things that we look for happiness and just smashing them to bits on the rocks below, his whole point in doing that is to say, what if we gave a big middle finger to the system of thinking that we've all seemed to inherit from our culture that says, I need to reach X in order to be happy. I need to obtain X in order to be happy. I need to purchase X in order to be happy. I need to have X amount in the bank account to be happy. I need to have this to be happy. I need to have that to be happy. What if we just flipped that off and said, I'm not going to play by those rules. I'm not even going to play that game. I am just going to try to enjoy the little things I have here right in front of me. And again, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but I think it helps to keep this in mind because we can get bogged down in his tearing all this stuff down and miss why he's doing it. He's not doing it to be a Debbie Downer. He's doing it to say you're looking for happiness in all the wrong places. Because at the end of the day, we are all looking for happiness. And the only deciding factor is, are you going to accept that happiness doesn't last? So maybe I should just make the most of those little happy moments that I do get when they come. Or are you going to keep chasing after them, grasping for wind as if you can make something stay that is, by its very nature, impermanent? Going back to Brown's quote, he says, Qoheleth observes that the rich never reach that level of sufficiency in which amassing more becomes irrelevant. Like streams flowing into the bottomless sea, wealth does not fulfill, and therein lies the vanity. Riches kept are riches lost. Whereas Qoheleth complains elsewhere about his lack of control in determining who would inherit or receive his wealth, he laments here of the possibility of having no one to pass it on to at all. Now, that last bit gets into verse 14 a little, and I haven't read that yet, so just keep that bit in mind about not having anything to pass on to someone. We'll get to that in a second. Going back to verse 11, Rabbi Rami Shapiro in the Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained commentary says, this is the nature of foolishness. You sacrifice the only joy there is in the world, the joy of eating simply, drinking moderately, working at something you love, and loving friends and family, in order to defeat the specter of Hevel, only to succumb to it, leaving your children with nothing, not even your love. Really need an oh dang clip in there, because boy does he have a way with words. In the end, we all die, so why waste your life building fortunes? End of quote. Wow. That is powerful. In fact, I'd say hit that little back button a few times and just listen to that quote again. He says so much in just a few words there. In seeing what Qoheleth saw, Douglas Fife observes that you can have wealth or friends, but not both. You can have wealth or sleep, but not both. And it's funny how many Americans seem to think that they can give up on their friends or their family and sleep in the present moment in favor of gaining wealth to enjoy later. So basically, if I stress myself out, way overwork myself now, put off all that stuff now, I'll be able to enjoy it in the future. I'll sleep when I'm dead, is what a lot of people would say. Well, Qoheleth would call that Hevel. What's the point of wealth if you're going to be too old to enjoy it? When are you actually going to get to retire? What's the point of rest if you have no one to vacation with because you focused only on your career? You know, why waste 30 years with your head down to the grind just to not have anything to do with it later on in life? Like, you're going to have to do those 30 plus years of work one way or the other. Might as well punctuate it with some good moments with some people you care about. Now, verse 12 has a little bit of an interesting variation in how it's read. It says, the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. So some people read the end of this verse as the rich man worrying that his goods will be stolen. But others think that his abundance actually leads to overeating, which then leads to the inability to sleep well. That may sound a little far-fetched, but I think the message gets at it pretty well. It says, hard and honest work earns a good night's sleep, whether supper is beans or steak. But a rich man's belly gives him insomnia. So, in other words, this verse could be saying that either the rich man can't sleep because he's stressed about losing the riches that he has, or the rich man can't sleep because his riches allowed him to overeat and gorge himself, and now his stomach is bothering him and he can't sleep. I think either one of those could work, and if nothing else, the second one is a little bit more humorous of an image that I find quite intriguing. Now, verse 13, he says, there is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail. And he begets a son, and there's nothing in his hand. As he came forth out of his mother's womb, naked will he return to go as he came, and will take nothing of his labor which he may carry away in his hand. This also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so will he go. And what profit does he have who labored for the wind? All his days he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. I'll leave those last few verses of the chapter for a few minutes here. But verse 13, when he says that this is a sore evil, riches kept for the owners to their own hurt. This is about hoarding, having what the Bible Project calls a scarcity mindset. This is something that happens with a lot of people, and the best way to illustrate it is anytime a big storm comes in. Now, I live in the Northeast. We get snowstorms in the winter, and whenever you get the slightest hint of a snowstorm, the stores automatically just mysteriously lose all of the bread, milk, and eggs that are there because everybody just rushes there, gets that, maybe sometimes bottled water as well. The joke is that it's a bunch of people who love French toast because they always just go for the bread, milk, and eggs so they can make French toast during the storm. But you just get this idea that people think, oh, I have to stock up right now or I'm never going to get an opportunity again. No, you're going to get an opportunity again. The storm is going to pass. It's probably not even going to come anymore. We rarely get any kind of big snowstorm. The chances of needing that are pretty small. And then what happens is we end up with waste, and we waste all of that food and just throw it out because now it's gone bad. What's interesting is I see this mostly in older Americans, like Gen X and up. And I think part of the reason for that is that, especially the further back you go, the less these people had in abundance growing up. Heck, even just to the time of the boomer generation, a lot of families didn't necessarily have a refrigerator in the house. That was a novelty at the time. So, you couldn't keep a bunch of food around. You didn't have the opportunity to, and now you do, and so you stockpile it, and you don't realize that, oh, I might not actually need all that. And I think even more so with their parents' generation, the ones that grew up during the World Wars and the Depression, because they lived through the Great Depression, they kind of tended to hoard. And we saw this a lot with my grandparents on my dad's side, is when my grandfather passed, the entire house was floor to ceiling covered in junk. And most of it was junk. I mean, there were a few treasures in there, but most of it was literal junk. Coffee stirrers from the gas station, or sauce packets from Arby's or something like that, or Gatorade that expired 5 years ago, something that was probably supposed to be a present for somebody 10 years ago, and it just ended up going to waste. This is very much an American thing because we have so much abundance in our culture. We have so much, and yet we act as if we have so little. The average family here in America could make it several days on the food they have in the house without ever needing to go to the store. And yet sometimes we just stress and panic, and it's like our brains shut off and we just rush to get whatever was needed. I mean, this happened during COVID, right? With everybody freaking out over toilet paper and hand sanitizer and face masks and the tests, and I can't get any more of these. And so you have these people stockpiling. You see someone with an entire shopping cart full of toilet paper. It's like, you're not going to use that. You're never going to have to buy toilet paper again for the rest of your life with how much you bought there. And, I'm laughing a little bit because it's a ludicrous image, but honestly, it is a very harmful way to live. Harmful to yourself because you're spending more than you need to, and also psychologically because now you have to worry about that stockpile that you now have. What if somebody steals it? What if it goes bad? What if it gets damaged? I mean, this is like the plot of every survival story, right? The post apocalypse people that have to try to ration all of these goods and everything. We act like that, but we're pre apocalypse. We're all like little mini doomsday preppers sometimes when these things happen. And that's not healthy to live in this scarcity mindset. It hurts me and it hurts you because I am taking away an opportunity for you to be able to enjoy what I have. You have this in the realm of collecting too, whether it is action figure collectibles or sometimes expensive bottles of alcohol or cars or whatever it might be. We just drive up the price of these things because we have a few people that grab all of them when they're on sale or when they're on the store and then scalp later on for a much higher price on a secondary market. That is a scarcity mindset. Nobody likes that person. And just like you don't like that person when it comes to your collectible or your favorite bottle of whiskey, don't be that person when it comes to toilet paper or bread and milk either. There is enough to go around. And this is a whole other conversation for another day, but I would highly recommend check out what Bible Project has done on this. They've talked a lot about how Jesus comes into a world of a scarcity mindset and says, what if you lived as if there was enough? What if you lived as if there wasn't a scarcity? What if you realized that humans have been around for a long time now and we're still around? We have survived some awful stuff and we're still here. Maybe there's a little more abundance in this world that God has given us than what we tend to think. So the next time you're considering stocking up on something, think about the last time you did and how long it took you to use what you stockpiled. And consider what might happen if all you took was what you needed and you left the rest for everyone else. Consider what it would be like if you're the person at the store who gets there when the shelves are empty because someone took a little bit more than they needed to. In a sea of people who act as if there's not enough to go around, what if you acted as if there were? How might that change the situation? It's a powerful thought. Nearly every translation sees verse 14 as a business venture gone wrong, some misfortune that happens, where it reads, "Those riches perish by evil travail." Regarding verse 15, Shapiro says, "We are born with nothing and we die with nothing. So why try to fill the intervening years with stuff?" Qoheleth isn't opposed to things or the joy things can bring, but he finds the notion that quantity rather than quality is the key to happiness not only ludicrous, but actually at the root of all suffering. Happiness, not money, is the true wealth. End of quote. Now, some of you, as I read verse 15, as he came from his mother's womb, naked will he go as he came, and will take nothing of his labor, which he will carry away from his hand. Some of you may have thought of Job, and there are actually some commentators who think that Qoheleth may have had the story of Job in mind here. There's some language in these verses that sound very reminiscent of Job, and one of those is the verse, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked will I return there. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And some of you now have a worship song stuck in your head, so you're welcome for that. But it is definitely possible that Qoheleth could be drawing on the story of Job, but I don't think there's any need to narrow his focus to that and say that he is absolutely referencing that story. The general nature of his statements make them relatable to several situations. Now, verse 16, Qoheleth says it is a, quote, painful evil. Now, you'll get different translations here. Remember that how you interpret the book as a whole is kind of going to influence how you translate things like painful evil, and how you translate them is going to affect how you interpret the book as a whole, so it's kind of this vicious cycle. It's going to depend on how you think he views God. A lot of translations are going to try to kind of tame these down a little bit and say that it's just a misfortune that happens or something along those lines. But I think it's worth keeping the literal translation of evil here, because I think he is actually putting a moral element onto this injustice he sees in life, because he is like calling God to task for saying life should work like Proverbs. It should be that the good get rewarded, the bad get punished. But there is a glitch in your system, God, and this is a painful evil to see. Qoheleth is calling God to task for allowing painful evil to be in his system. He's saying there is a bug in your code as the grand coder of the universe. You should have seen this. You should have taken care of this. And some of you listening, that might make you a little uncomfortable to think about. Like, oh, we're not supposed to question God. Who are we? His ways are higher than our ways, and all that we hear in church. Firstly, that's not actually what those verses mean. Yet again, another issue for another day. We definitely have to cover the his ways are higher than our ways verses, because that's a really misused passage. But for time's sake, I have to say no at the moment. So just keep bugging me about that. We'll get to that eventually. But I don't think that mindset is helpful either. And to the people who think, oh, you can't question God, and who are you to ask him why something happened, I'd just say, have you ever read the Psalms? Have you ever read the book of Lamentations? Have you ever read Job? Now, I realize that how you interpret Job could make it seem like he was in the wrong for asking those questions, but that's a little bit questionable on which way that interpretation goes. And besides, even at the end of the book, God points out to Job's friends that he did nothing wrong. He doesn't say, oh yeah, Job did nothing wrong except question me. He says Job did nothing wrong. Again, here's the multivocality of Scripture. Here's where we have to look at the Bible and say it actually invites us into having these hard conversations with God. If God created us as his images, if God created us in his likeness, if God created us with a strong sense of moral right and wrong, I mean, just think about a child and how early they get this very clear sense of right and wrong, of that's not fair. And the parents have to teach them, yeah, you're right, that's not fair, but life isn't fair, right? So many of us heard that growing up. But they're right. Both the kids and the parents. It's not fair. And yet, life isn't fair. And yet we think that there's a God who created all of this with meaning and purpose. So what gives, God? And that is a fair question to ask. Now, I know some of the theologians want to jump in and say, well, it's not God's fault. It's because we live in a fallen world. And yes, I get all of that. And aside from the fact that I would say it is a world in which we failed, not one in which we fell. Go back to our conversation on Genesis 3 for that. But throughout the Bible, we have people who don't just roll over and accept the state of the world as it is. The Bible is full of people who question God and who honestly say things that would make the average churchgoer blush. Now, I know not all of you listening might agree with me on this, but I personally think that God would rather someone be honest and harsh in their expression of emotion to him than just swallow it down and say, well, I guess this is the way life has to be. I think God is big enough to handle our complaints and concerns and frustrations. I don't think we have to be afraid of sharing them with him. I think he actually wants to hear them from us. And I think that when we call out the injustices in the systems of our world today, we are actually glorifying God and imaging him well, because he is just, righteous, holy. And so when we call out abuse and things that have gone wrong in the world and say this isn't the way it's supposed to be, we are actually being very much like him. So here Qoheleth says that it is a painful evil for us to leave this world in the same fashion in which we arrived, with nothing. And when you think about it, that is frustrating. You work for 30, 40, sometimes even 50 years of your life, and what do you have for it the second you die? Not much of anything. It makes sense that we'd all start on the same playing field of having nothing to begin with, but you would think that the people who put in the most effort could get a little bit more in the end. But no, we all just finish the same way that we started, with nothing. And that's depressing when you think about it. Verse 17, all his days he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. Literally, the verse reads, and all his days he eats in darkness, greatly irritated, suffering, and frustrated. It could be talking about a literal sickness, or maybe just suffering is, what they mean by that word sickness. Some translations smooth it out to say that he lives in darkness, but I think that actually misses a key metaphor in using that word eating. Eating is meant to be a communal activity. In fact, it's one of the few pleasures that Qoheleth frequently promotes in the book. It could even possibly tie onto other biblical themes of eating, like from the garden. The man and woman ate from the tree. It's possible that image of eating shows up a lot in the wisdom literature of the Bible. So I don't think that'd be too much of a stretch, but I think the main idea here is that eating is supposed to be a communal thing. Now, in our modern American culture, so many of us grab McDonald's on the way home and we eat it in the car. I'm not saying that's necessarily a morally evil thing to do, but eating is meant to be communal. In fact, it's healthier. Now, I'm no scientist and I'm no physician or dietitian, so please realize I'm not speaking out of an area of authority for me here. But as I understand it, it is significantly healthier for us to eat slowly and sitting down and to actually take the time to chew and enjoy our food. And psychologically, that is so much more enjoyable too. I mean, how many times do you actually enjoy eating McDonald's on the road? How many times do you enjoy a sit down dinner? It's an entirely different experience. Food isn't just meant to be this utilitarian thing that keeps us going. It's meant to be something that actually sparks conversation and grows friendships and allows for the senses to be satisfied. It's this whole body experience in a lot of ways that we have just stripped down to its bare utilitarian roots and said, well, I'm just going to eat while I work or eat while I drive so that I can make up lost time. I think we're actually meant to pause and eat so that we're forced to pause, so that we're forced to slow down from our hustle and bustle, and so that we're forced to realize there's life outside of my little tunnel vision bubble that I've created here. And sometimes we need to, I know it's cliche, but stop and smell the roses. That's part of what eating does, is it's supposed to set up this rhythm of pausing and realizing that the world will continue on if we're not working for the next half hour. We can all afford to take that time out of our day, whether we feel like it or not. And yes, I'm preaching to myself right now too, because I honestly eat more lunches while I'm working than I do take breaks. And that's something that I think, based on what we talked about here this week, I want to actually try to change. I want to get out of my office and sit somewhere else to eat just for a change of pace, because it's healthy and it's better for us when we can pause when we eat. Let's not be like this guy who eats in darkness all of his days. Let's share those times with friends and enjoy a good meal. Put a little effort into making it extra special and take the time to actually enjoy it. And along those lines, you can waste your whole life dreaming about getting the good life and miss out on the good life that's right in front of you all along. That's really what we're doing when we're rushing. We're just trying to get to the good life. We're trying to make that bonus check for the month. We're trying to make that promotion. We're trying to pay off those bills. We're trying to obtain the American dream, whatever it is. And we're missing the life that's in front of us right now. We're so stressed over hitting our next objective, scratching off the next thing on our bullet point list of life, that we miss life. You can't buy or obtain the good life. You have to choose it. You have to choose it where you are. I realize that some people have that option a little bit easier than other people. It's one thing for me to say that here in my comfy New Jersey home. It'd not be so easy if I was in a town in Ukraine right now on the border near Russia. It would not be so easy if I was in a Palestinian refugee camp. It would not be so easy if I was in an Israelite city under threat of attack. So I want to acknowledge I am speaking out of a place of privilege here where I am in America, but I think that it's worth knowing that Qoheleth was speaking to people who didn't have the same privilege that he did. And whether you think he was King Solomon or someone else, I mean, he obviously has enough power and prestige that his words are being written down. Most of the people who are listening to that aren't going to be in that position. And yet he still thinks that there's something that they can choose in life to make it a little bit better. And I'm not trying to say, and I don't think Qoheleth is trying to say that, oh, if you just choose to be happy, you'll be happy. Or if you choose to be sad, you'll be sad. That's an oversimplification, and I think that can be a harmful thing to say to someone. But I do think there is something of value in the idea that you get what you're looking for. If you are focusing on all of the ways that life sucks and goes wrong for you, you're going to see all the ways that life sucks and goes wrong for you. If you're focused on trying to find all of the little good things in life, you're going to notice a lot more of the little good things in life that you miss. And different people are better at this than others. I will admit, I am not someone who easily sees the bright side. I am much more a pessimist than I am an optimist. I like to think I'm just a realist, but we all know that's actually just a pessimist who thinks he's better than the rest of the pessimists. And it's hard for me sometimes. I mean, I have a great life. And yet, as I've said before on the podcast, I struggle with depression. And it's really hard for me sometimes to look on the bright side of life. But it is a muscle that I can exercise a little bit more. It's something where I can try to purposefully set aside these times to pause and appreciate the good things, like the meal that we just talked about, instead of rushing to solve my next problem. Now, I'm not saying that, the depression that I deal with is my fault for, being a workaholic or anything like that, but maybe it's aggravated by it. Maybe because I'm so quick to rush to fix the next problem at work, maybe that's why I'm seeing nothing but problems at work sometimes. I guess you get to hear me do a little bit of self-therapy right now, but hopefully it helps some of you as well, because I can't imagine I'm the only one who just gets in this tunnel vision, stressed out mindset where somebody else could look at life and think it's awesome, and I'm just looking at all of the problems. Well, again, choosing joy is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not suddenly going to make life incredible. But maybe it can make it suck a little less. And I think that's kind of the point of Ecclesiastes is here, we didn't actually give the series a name, so I guess here's the subtitle for the series is Ecclesiastes, How to Make Life Suck Less. That's a real selling point right there. Right? I should try to keep that idea, and if I ever turn these notes into a commentary, that'll be the name of the book. Ecclesiastes, How to Make Life Suck Less. But that really is kind of it. Like, he's a realist. He is acknowledging that there are times life sucks. He is not that person that we all know at church that has the plastered on smile and is always, oh, everything's wonderful because Jesus loves me and I'm a Christian and I have to be happy for God. I just got a terminal diagnosis at the doctor and all of my friends just died in a plane crash, but I'm happy because Jesus is my savior. No, don't be that person. Nobody likes that person. We all know it's fake. We all know you're hurting inside. So much better if you would just be honest about it. You're not fooling anyone. And you don't have to be that way. No matter what you think church or your pastor or God wants, God doesn't actually want you to pretend to be happy. And it's not even quite that reverse psychology of like, oh, let me just say I'm happy and then eventually I'll start to believe it. I mean, I think there is actually a little something to that. Like, the more you start to manifest it into existence because you're believing it yourself. I think there is something to that, but I don't think that's quite exactly what's going on here either. I think it's just the reality that life is full of bad things and good things. And neither one cancels out the other. Sometimes one wins out over the other for a little while, but maybe in the times when it's on the bad side, maybe there's still good in life that is just being hidden by the bad right now. Maybe the sun's just behind the clouds and we need to. I was going to say you need to look for the sun up there, but that's a fast way to end up with eye problems, so I guess that analogy doesn't work. But I think you get the picture of what I'm trying to say here. There is still a sun back there, even when the clouds are covering it. I think that's what Qoheleth is trying to get across, is like, when the rain clouds completely block out the sun, realize that the sun is still there. Okay, let's finish up chapter 5 here. Verse 18, Behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely, and that word comely, it's the Hebrew word yafeh. It means beautiful, right, pleasing, so it's a good thing. I have seen this good thing, for someone to eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor that he takes under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, because it is his portion. Every person, now translations might say every man, but it's not gendered in that way. It's speaking to every person. Every person also to whom God has given riches and wealth and has given them power to eat thereof, to take their portion, to rejoice in their labor, this is the gift of God. Because he will not much remember the days of his life, because God answers him in the joy of his heart. Now, yes, that last verse is pretty tough to translate and interpret, so we'll get into that in just a second here. But this is where I think Qoheleth is kind of coming out of the weeds a little bit. He's coming back up for air, and he's saying that to enjoy the good of your labor, that's literally to see good in all his trouble. So this is back in verse 18, where a lot of translations will say to enjoy the good of all his labor that he takes under the sun. It's literally to see good in all his trouble. In other words, life sucks for everyone. There is trouble for everyone, rich and poor, old and young. So what good are you going to choose to see? It's that word see. It's a lot of translations will say enjoy, but it's actually see. Like, you're looking for this joy in the midst of trouble. Brown in the interpretation commentary says, while death devalues life defined exclusively in terms of gain and self-enrichment, it nevertheless heightens the value of these simple gifts. And he's talking about the time to eat and drink and enjoy good times with friends that Qoheleth mentions. Brown continues, such is the mixed lot of mortals, which embraces both the delight and the drudgery, the joy amidst life's brevity. One portion of that lot, and that's the Hebrew word kelek. It's translated as portion in the Old King James, but a lot of translations will say lot or inheritance, or I think of it if you start a board game like Monopoly or Risk or something like that, and you have a certain number of players or a certain amount of money or something at the start of the game, that is your lot. That is your portion that you have. Just as part of playing the game, you have that as your right. That's what this idea is. So Brown continues, one portion of that lot is like a plot of fertile land, passed on from one generation to the next. It is the apportioned field of dreams, of joyous episodes and moments that constitute an integral part of the limited and rugged landscape of human existence. On the one hand, to demand that lot, as in the case of the prodigal son, and to try to wrest from it the means of self-glory and escape from responsibility, is to violate its integrity as God's gift. This portion of joy is distorted into something to be grasped and hoarded, a product of obsessive toiling, yet never fulfilling a person's self-obsessed expectations. On the other hand, this inheritance requires cultivation, specifically a cultivated awareness, so that its yield is developed and savored as a source of delight and respite. The lot to which Qoheleth refers is a given. It requires work and provides enjoyment. But get this now, it is never the object of pursuit or of one's grasping. The redemptive nature of these moments of joy lies first and foremost in the recognition that they are gifts from God. Indeed, the ability to enjoy simple pleasures is itself a divinely inspired capacity. Wealth is devalued when it is employed as a means. Its luster shines brightly, however, when it is enjoyed in gratitude for its own sake. To push Qoheleth's thought a bit further, shared. Furthermore, the ability to enjoy such gifts prevents one from brooding, or literally calling to mind. Such brooding suggests a wallowing in nostalgia. And with that last part, he's comparing to chapter 5, verse 20. That's the end of the quote there. I think he has a lot of wisdom in that, of saying that God gives us all some things to enjoy in this life. And if we take them as our prerogative, as our right, as our purpose for living, we're going to miss out because they are by nature transitory. They're like bubbles. They're beautiful when you see them floating in the air, but they're going to pop in just a second. You would be foolish to try to catch one because you're just going to make it pop faster. And then you didn't even get to enjoy the time that it was there. But if you realize that it's a gift and it's just meant to be enjoyed for its own sake, then you can adjust your expectations and not get mad at the bubble for bursting because it's a bubble. You'll just enjoy it for what it is in the time that it's there and realize that there's going to be another bubble that you'll get to see floating in the air, following right behind it shortly thereafter. That is what life is like. Now, in Qoheleth's world, God is the one who determines if your plans work out or not. Qoheleth is trying to get us to let go of our demands for control and just let life happen. This doesn't have to be wholly about determinism and predestination and, what has God actually said is going to happen in our lives? Are we robots? Do we have free will? We've talked about that a little bit in previous episodes because Qoheleth's words can easily be read as determinism. Basically, God is just going to do whatever he wants. We're just bits of code in his simulation. But I don't think we have to read it that way. I don't think we have to read this as meaning that God is just going to play favorites or be random and just choose a random winner to, give success to in life. I think the focus is actually more so on the fact that we are not in control of our lives. By putting God in the place of the person who gives all of this to us, Qoheleth is saying we're not the ones who decide all this. And that can be a hard pill to swallow. We like to think we're in control of our lives. Whether or not we admit it, we are all, in a sense, control freaks. Now, all you have to do is drive on the road and hit a little bit of a delay or a detour, and you'll see just how much of a control freak you are. Because your plan has now been derailed. And you're angry, you're frustrated, you're yelling, you're cursing, you're worried about your next place that you have to get to. The reality is that you thought you had it all in control. You thought you knew if I left at this time, I'd get there at that time. But you were never in control of that. There were always chances that other things could happen. There were always variables in life. And the reason you got mad when traffic was delayed is because you thought you were God for a minute. You thought you had everything under control. You thought if I hit these buttons just right, I'm going to get this result. If I leave at this time, I am going to get there at that time. But what happened is you came face to face with the reality that you're not in control. And if you could just realize that before you left the house, you wouldn't be quite so mad when traffic got backed up. That's not to say you're going to be jumping for joy when you see the detour, but it's not going to now ruin your day. And that's what happens with so many of us is we have these little things that happen, and I'll admit they are bad things. They are frustrating things, but we think that we're in control, and those things remind us that we're not, and that's why they blow up so big and ruin our entire day. If we would start with the reality, the realization that there are always variables out there, and I can try to stack the odds in my favor as much as I like, but there is always a chance that things are not going to go my way today. And if we can start with that assumption, then when things don't go our way, we won't be so ticked off. We might still be bummed, we might still be a little upset, we might still be inconvenienced, but now the world hasn't ended. Because we have put a little buffer room in there to say, I'm leaving a little space for the unexpected things. I am expecting the unexpected to happen today. So by putting God as the person who gives us the good things in life, Qoheleth is reminding us that we actually have no control over it. Life is like living in a rented mansion, where the owner could come back at any time and take his house back and force you to leave. It would be naive to think that you could stay there forever. but it would be foolish not to live up all the benefits of being in a mansion while you could live there. We own nothing, but rent everything. Now, here's where we have to get a little grammar nerdy for a second with verse 20, because it says, he will not remember the days of his life because God answers him in the joy of his heart. The main difficulty here is with that word that was translated answered in the King James. It shows up other times in Ecclesiastes with a negative meaning. This is in chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 3, verse 10. But, and this is in Seeing What Qoheleth Saw by Douglas Fife, he points out that there are also positive or neutral ways that you could translate this. So, in other words, it could be saying that God just keeps humans occupied with life, basically running the little hamster wheel and just constantly being too busy. That's the negative interpretation. Or you have more of a positive one that would say he answers with this, he responds with this, he gives it back, the joy in his heart. So a negative reading would say that God keeps someone busy with the joy of his heart. So in other words, it's almost like having the carrot on the stick. You're just constantly running, trying to chase after something that you never actually get. Or in the positive reading, it could be because God gives him back the joy of his heart. Either one makes sense, and this is an instance where I might actually lean toward the more positive reading because he is speaking positively in these few verses. He's kind of returning to his thesis, his take home of how to actually enjoy the good life here. So I think he could be saying that God returns back to this person the joy of their heart. Now, another complication with this is just the first part of the verse where it says he will not much remember the days of his life. Is that talking about potentially someone getting older and having like dementia or Alzheimer's and they can't remember anything? Is it just saying that the longer life goes on, the less you remember some of the stresses and the more you just try to remember the good times? This is another case where you have that word for that could be because or it could be indeed. So I think this might actually be a case where it should be indeed. So, like, indeed, he's not going to remember much about his life. And why is that? Because God just returns to him the joys that he's had. Like, maybe it's saying that God is the one who brings back to mind those pleasant memories. You know, there is no clear-cut, clean way to translate this verse. And I would be curious for your thoughts on this. Maybe what do you think about when you hear this? Like, how would you interpret verse 20? What do you think it's trying to say? Because in all honesty, I'm not 100% sure, and you don't get a ton of clarity from reading commentaries on that particular verse. Regardless of what it's exactly saying, though, it is still grouped in this section of verses that's talking about how to actually enjoy the good life and focusing on the good things and how God actually gives those good things. So I think it's just kind of circling back around to that idea that God is the one who provides this, or put from the other angle, you're not the one who makes life good. You don't decide whether things are going to go your way or not today. So if we stop playing God and stop fooling ourselves into thinking that we actually have control over our lives, we can better enjoy the moments that we have in front of us. Uncut reads, a survey of all the passages in which Qoheleth speaks of pleasure reveals that, while he commends it during life for those who are able to find it, he knows that it has no ultimate meaning, no profit, that Hebrew word yitron we talked about in the first episode, and so it's ultimately meaningless, or hevel. Pleasure is all there is during one's earthly existence, advises Qoheleth, so enjoy it now, if you can. I really like how Shapiro builds on all of this. He says, the book of Ecclesiastes is a guide to simcha. Simcha is the Hebrew word for joy. Not permanent joy, because there is no permanence, but the only joy a person can experience in this life. Fleeting, but no less satisfying joy. When we wrongly imagine that Qoheleth hates life and decries the value of all effort, we can't imagine why he might speak of joy at all. But when we realize that he's leading us to joy by first freeing us from the illusions of surety, security, and permanence that plague our lives, then we can see how helpful and positive a vision he's really offering. There is no joy in efforts made to overcome hevel, because impermanence can't be overcome. Such efforts only bring riet ruach and rayon ruach, a troubling of your breath. But there is joy in effort made in sync with Hevel. Knowing that death is inevitable, and all too soon, leads the sage to find joy in daily life, no matter how difficult that life may be. Knowing that working in hopes of securing a trouble-free retirement is useless, you are now free to find work you enjoy, even if low-paying. Knowing that all relationships end frees you to find joy in the moments before they end. Knowing that there's no guarantee you'll have food to eat tomorrow frees you to enjoy the food you have today. This is the simcha Qoheleth offers us. Death and tragedy are unavoidable, but futility is only present if you imagine there should be a way out. End of quote. Alright, how are we feeling after all that? I know we covered quite a bit this week. I actually originally thought we were going to be able to get Chapter 6 in this week as well, because it does play on the themes of Chapter 5. It kind of builds right on it. So I was planning on going into Chapter 6, but I didn't quite realize just how much there was to talk about here in the second half of Chapter 5. There's a lot of really practical wisdom here. And I know we got into some nerdy bits, but I'm just constantly amazed by how much the book of Ecclesiastes speaks into our present day. I feel like it's one of the most neglected books in churches today. And I think part of that's because of the translations and how people think it's this really negative Debbie Downer sort of book. But I'm hoping as you're going through this with me that you're seeing there's a lot of practical wisdom in this. It's one of the most honest books in the entirety of the Bible, because it talks about the ways that life doesn't work out the way that it should in an ideal world. And that's where we find ourselves. So it really speaks into our situation today. I've been enjoying this. I hope you have as well. I'd love to hear back from you on any thoughts you have on the episodes. You can comment on Spotify. There's a place, if you're listening in the app, where you can do that there. You can send us a message on socials. Just comment on any of the posts we have. You can email us at cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can also do that on our website. There is a form at the bottom. And just let us know what you're thinking of the series, what thoughts you have on it, how it may have changed your perception of Ecclesiastes or of life in general. Like, have you found this helpful? Do you agree with what Qoheleth is saying? Do you disagree? Do you find yourself more traditionally thinking in line with Proverbs, or do you find yourself a little more on the side of Qoheleth, where he makes a little more sense? We'd love to hear from you. And remember, if you enjoy what we talk about, please take the time to share it with a friend. Take the time to rate and review it, especially on Apple and Spotify. It really does actually help to get the podcast in front of other people. We're starting to see it grow a little bit, and we've had some new listeners over the last few weeks here. It's really, really awesome to see. Next week, we're going to cover Chapter 6, continue this conversation on wealth, riches, and as Brown in the interpretation commentary said, we'll be addressing joy's polar opposite, which is desire. There's a lot of great material in that chapter, so I'm looking forward to it. And until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.